This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Ahmed Fouad Al Khatib, a Palestinian American writer, analyst, and peace activist. Born in Saudi Arabia in 1990, where his father worked as a doctor for the UN, he returned with his family to Gaza when he was 10 years old, as his father had a new job in Jabalia. Ahmed came to the US in 2005 at the age of 15 on a cultural exchange program, and he met Jews and Israelis there for the first time. He was later granted political asylum in America. Now, Ahmed knows more than most about the tragedy of war. He was caught up in an Israeli airstrike in 2001, losing three of his friends when he was a child. And in the current Gaza war, he's also tragically lost many of his friends and even family members. Well, Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us this week. Okay, so if we can
Thanks so much
start
for having
off,
me.
Ahmed, um, by just digging into your experience. I'm curious about your experience of meeting Jews and Israelis for the first time in America. Can you take us back to that moment and describe where you were coming from and what it was like and what you learned?
I remember it so vividly. It was in 2005, and I had joined a Palestinian Israeli dialogue group. It was the very group that helped me find a host mother in the United States. So the program that I came with was a year-long effort to be here in high school, live with an American family, and then go back to Gaza and build cultural bridges. It was a post 9/11 initiative by the United States State Department. And so I had trouble. The arrangement that I had fell through, and an email went out to the community, and it was picked up by a Jewish Palestinian dialogue group. And they, without knowing me, without just knowing very little about myself, just sent out this email and said there's this young man from Gaza in need of a home. And they helped me find my host mother with whom I lived the entirety of the year. And so as a just I was really grateful and thankful, and I wanted to just attend as a way of saying thank you. um, I will say I remember vividly the car being parked outside before we went into the group, and me being a little bit like, oh wow, like meeting Israelis and Jews outside of Gaza. This was going to be the first time that I met Israelis mainly in the form of Israeli soldiers, and I don't count that as actually meeting people. Um, when I went in there, it was a large group, and it was absolutely phenomenal in terms of the setting, making people comfortable. People were extraordinarily kind, interested, almost protective of me, even though many were very proud Zionists and I identified strongly with Israel. There was a real sincere effort to try to just make me feel like I belong there, that I am part of the group. And then as time went on, I remember just sharing a little bit about my background, sharing a little bit about the issues of Gaza, sharing a little bit about the Palestinian narrative, either in terms of in ways that they haven't heard, or kind of some of my contrarian ideas that made it difficult for me to be in Gaza. I mean, I was always an old soul in a young body. So this group was immensely valuable for me to, as part of almost like the healing and reconciliation at an individual level for me as Ahmed. And so, but I also want to be honest and transparent. There were numerous difficult moments. There were very tense moments. I think a combination of, we knew that we were all coming from a place of wanting to build bridges, wanting to acknowledge each other's humanity, wanting to acknowledge the right of both people, that both narratives do not have to cancel each other out. And that was really my early experience with, you hear me nowadays with the current situation talking about the two sides can coexist side by side with their narratives not having to cancel each other out. And that was really my first experience with that, and it was immensely valuable. As for the times when we disagreed, I mean, it was because we knew that we were both coming from a good place where I wasn't interested in annihilating Zionism and annihilating Israel and erasing their history. And they were genuinely interested in hearing about my experiences and Nakba and the Palestinian suffering and the hardships. We found common ground across our differences. We agreed to disagree sometimes. We worked through specific issues. So it was a really transformative experience.
Now, we hear so much about the brainwashing that takes place in Gaza. I suppose this was some time ago, so it was before Hamas were really completely in control of every element of Gazan society. Um, do you think that if you'd come from Gaza in more recent years, where Hamas were in control, you would have reacted differently towards meeting Jews in America?
On the one hand, I mean, I certainly may have, in the sense that I would have experienced more grander scale wars, and the restrictions and the regime of closures and restrictions that became known as the blockade by Israel and Egypt. A lot of people don't want to mention the Egypt part of the blockade. It's only Israel, but no, it was two sides that imposed the blockade. On the one hand, there may have been a chance that I would have been a bit more resentful, perhaps. But on the other hand, I absolutely think that there are numerous people in Gaza, even as Hamas was rising, whether it be through just the control, through the infamous elections, or after they ejected the Palestinian Authority in 2007 and took over. Numerous Gazans that I know personally, that I saw on social media, that I saw online, were critical of Hamas. Early on, speaking about Hamas's theft of the gasoline that goes to the power station and how that caused power shortages, talking about the set of restrictions, talking about the ideology, talking about if back in 2008, soon after Hamas's control, the Islam attempt to Islamize the society. For example, Hamas came up with a rule that women could not, smoke hookah, the water pipe, on the beaches, the beach parks, and people are like, "What's wrong with you?" So like, I guess throughout the time from when I left to the current moment, there's been consistent and opposition to Hamas, anger at Hamas, rejection of their ideology. Unfortunately, that is often missed either deliberately or through ignorance, or because those sentiments are hard to capture because of the polls. And we can talk about the polls later now, show a certain image. But throughout my time here, I promise you that large segments of Gaza's society were absolutely opposed to Hamas, even if they had issues with Israel or the Jewish narrative or etc. But
Well,
the
no,
number of Gazans that have left since I came here.
right.
Go ahead.
Let's just jump to talking about the polls now. I mean, I do want to talk about some other things, but since the polls have come up, it's been quite a big deal, hasn't it? There was a poll recently that said that 71% of Gazans were in favour of October the 7th, and indeed 71% of people on the West Bank too. We were talking off air earlier about my friend in Gaza who I spoke to quite recently, who said that everyone he knows hates Hamas. He hates Hamas. He thinks the polls are a load of rubbish, but they're quite respected polls. They weren't just invented. What's your reading of what they mean? What people really think? I mean, what's going on?
And I want to start by making it clear that my intention is not to ever manufacture dissent where none exists. I absolutely acknowledge that Hamas has a base of support. That is indisputable. However, I have been highly and extraordinarily critical of these polls for a variety of reasons. And you were so kind of let me publish a piece in the Jewish Chronicle a few months ago in which I did address some elements of the perceptions of these polls. So let's dig in. Number one is in a Gaza context, in a Palestinian context, and I'm talking about the Gaza Strip. The West Bank is somewhat of a separate story we can talk about later. Specific about Gaza. Can you imagine somebody coming up to you right now in the midst of war, in the midst of Hamas agents being everywhere? Hamas is very much so still in control, and asking you, what do you think about October 7th? Or what do you think about Israel? You're either going to think this is an Israeli informant or this is a Hamas spy or a secret agent. Gaza is not a democratic society. The Palestinian territories were not a democratic society. We're not used to truly expressing our free thoughts, lest one be called a traitor, or lest one be identified within the community. Look at the number, even in the free world, in the Western world, look at the number of Palestinians, or how few are openly speaking out against Hamas, even though many of them deeply despise Hamas. There's the sense of not dirtying out not airing out the dirty laundry. There's a sense of we need to have this unity against the Israeli side. Number two is, in addition to the samples, in addition to some of the technical methodologies, I think there's a conflation between support for October 7th, which I, you know where I stand on that, and you know how vehemently opposed I am to terror and violence against the Jewish people, and how and I've my record speaks for itself. Support for October 7th does not equate default support for Hamas. The idea of resistance enjoys support resistance across, whether it be diplomatic, nonviolent, or the armed resistance. Unfortunately, Hamas has been successful after October 7th in reinvigorating the need for armed resistance from their point of view because everything else failed. And I grew up with this. The Zionists know nothing but the language of force and all the brainwashing. So therefore, there are people that despise Hamas, and I promise you, I know some of them, unfortunately, who think that October 7th, despite the damage or whatever, was helpful in getting the Palestinian cause on the map. So I think that's another way to interpret him is, and to their credit, the pollsters, the gentleman who did it, his organization says that. Now, I stand by my earlier point of view, whether as expressed in the Jewish Chronicle or my op-ed, as expressed with my regular statements on social media, that if you're sitting there, your home is destroyed, you're hungry, you're standing in line to use a dirty public bathroom with hundreds of people, your kid is sick and you can't give them a Tylenol because you can't find a Tylenol in sight, you're in a tent in the blistering heat in Gaza right now with very limited horizons. You're not sitting there and thinking, wow, Hamas did us a solid. Wow, I love Hamas. Wow, you're angry at Israel, but I assure you that the dominant narrative, even among some supporters of Hamas, by the way, and we saw that in the BBC article just a couple of days ago that spoke to Hamas mid-level manager or leaders in Gaza and actual supporters. You're not sitting there thinking, wow, this was brilliant. Not just because of the consequences, but because the people of Gaza have experienced multiple wars before. Hamas kept promising victory. Hamas promised Gazans that, be patient with the blockade and restrictions, and this is going somewhere. We're going to lead the path to liberation. They had a conferences where they were like, how are we going to administer Israel after we liberate it? So that I think there's tiers of the opposition to Hamas in ways that are not captured. And so I promise you, these polls are not representative, not because Hamas doesn't have support in Gaza, but because so many have awoken, sadly, through this horror that Hamas hates the Palestinian people. Hamas is a proxy of Iran, that we are pawns in a regional game that cares nothing about the Palestinians or the Palestinian national project.
Right. Well, I mean, if I can, forgive me, ask you a bit of a difficult or challenging question. I think that people on the Jewish side of the fence, if we can sadly call it that, and the Israeli side, I think the instinct is that we want the Palestinian side to be nice guys and to be peace-loving and to be partners for peace, as it were. And we saw, I mean, the people who were massacred in the kibbutzim on October the 7th were often peace activists who spent their lives learning Arabic, communicating with Gazans, transporting Gazans from Gaza to hospital in Israel and back, and so forth. And I think that what people felt on October the 7th was it felt like a wake-up call to many people. It felt like a betrayal. We had stories of people who had collaborated with photograph exhibitions, for example, with people on the Israeli side, Palestinians in Gaza, who then went on to use that information to try to murder them. We saw pictures of dead bodies being paraded through Gaza with mobs cheering and shouting and spitting on everyday people that we want to see as partners for peace. And I think there's a great sense of disillusionment and depression, and people, even committed peace activists, have now lost the trust in the other side to actually be partners for peace. They feel so betrayed and so forth. Can you just give me your response to that? What do you say to those people? What do you say to us with your knowledge of Gazan society?
The first thing that I would say is, I hear you. I acknowledge the pain. I acknowledge the sense of betrayal. I acknowledge the sense of disillusionment. I can't imagine feeling like in the midst of this horror and what took place on October 7th, trying to re-energize that side of you that wants to believe in coexistence and wants to believe in peace. And soon after acknowledging that, I would plead to ask for what is the alternative to actually trying to work towards healing and reconciliation. It cannot be a state of perpetual war, conflict, and mistrust. It cannot be that a few thousand fighters and terrorists that attacked the kibbutzim in Israel on October 7th, and a few thousand who celebrated and abused the hostages and the bodies, and a few more thousand who are members of Hamas. It cannot be that those people, those segments, determine our common future, our intertwined future, our intertwined need to work through the pain, the suffering, towards healing and reconciliation. While October 7th was unfolding, it was October 6th here, and because I launched an organization in 2015 to try to build an internationally run Israeli-approved airfield in the Gaza Strip, a humanitarian airfield. So I have a large network of contacts and friends and allies and my family in Gaza. I spoke to people who were absolutely horrified by what was unfolding, who knew that Hamas had done this because of their failures in Gaza, who knew that Hamas had done this because of Iranian instructions and financing and support and to stop the normalization. There are numerous people in Gaza that wanted to get daily permits to work in Israel. My dad, as he was passing away, he passed away 4 years ago, an Israeli team worked for free for an entire year to get him out of Gaza into Hadassah in Jerusalem, get him treatments, get him medications, tens of thousands of dollars worth of time and equipment and medication were donated for free. And the folks around the Gaza envelope were part of that. So I feel it personally. What I will say is Gaza's 2.3 million people. Let's assume that 300,000 are irredeemable in terms of membership in Hamas, the celebrations, what took place. Like that roughly leaves 2 million people that still want to live, that do not want to attack Jews, that do not want to hate. The other thing I will say is people are a product of their environment, and there's not even remotely any attempt to justify. But when you have an environment where something like close to 70% of Gazans have never left the Gaza Strip, they only know the Jews and Israelis across the fence from the brainwashing and the propaganda, but also from the bombardment, from the injustice. I mean, we cannot deny that the Netanyahu government had a major role to play in allowing Hamas's entrenchment, directly or indirectly, so that the Palestinians are divided politically, so that the Palestinian Authority, who are nowhere near angels, but were viable partners, were weakened in favor of the settlement movement, settlement expansion, killing the two-state solution. While I acknowledge, and I am a big kind of advocate in taking responsibility, acknowledging Palestinian agency, learning from our mistakes, learning from the historic mistakes, which are plentiful. There were absolutely injustices perpetrated against the Palestinian people in Gaza that have fueled this cycle of ignorance and incitement and hatred and violence and the desire for revenge. So again, what took place is a travesty. It was criminal. It was entirely unjustified. It triggered this war. It violated the ceasefire. And yet, if in a way, it makes the need for healing and reconciliation and pushing forward and actually finally probing deeply, not at a surface level, but probing deeply. What do we want to do here? Who are we as a people, as both Palestinians and Israelis? How are we going to work this out? Because 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Israelis aren't going anywhere. So I acknowledge the pain, but if anything, this makes the need to move forward that much more compelling. And I promise you that before October 7th, and certainly out of this tragedy, voices are there to actually build to build bridges towards peace and healing and reconciliation. The trauma is vast in Gaza. And this is where I lost 31 of my family members, my aunts and uncles and 12-year-old niece and immediate family members. And it is painful. Every day I have to renew my commitment to not wanting to. I want to break away from the cycle of hatred, incitement, violence, revenge, rinse, and repeat. So
Right.
I can do it. I talk to Israelis who want to do the same thing, and it is precisely this tragedy and sense of betrayal and sense of desperation and disillusionment that I think should motivate us to want to move forward.
Right. I mean, I had another question I was about to ask, but actually, I'm going to put that to one side to ask about you and your family and what Gaza is like now. I mean, I'm sure you're in touch with them fairly regularly. You've had these tragedies happen, for which everybody is listening to this must be filled with regret and horror. Can you just tell me a little bit about what you hear from people, your relatives living there in Gaza, what life is like, what they're going through, what their hopes and dreams are, and what their feelings are right now?
Certainly, certainly. No, I mean I knew that Gaza as we knew it would cease to exist as soon as I saw October 7th unfold. I knew that my family would pay a personal price, even though they're not involved. I'm the black sheep in a large medical family, involved in all sectors. And my brother right now, he is a senior director for medical aid for Palestinians, a British charity in Gaza. He has been in the NGO sector for many years. My middle brother worked for UNRWA. He left Gaza a couple of years ago. And so, three separate airstrikes on October 13th, October 25th, and December 14th destroyed the house that I grew up in, destroyed my second home where my mom's family lived. All my aunts and uncles in the second home were killed instantly. Children as young as 3 and 4 months old lost their lives, shredded to remains and bits and pieces. And all my cousins were all injured. The ones who didn't survive are badly injured. One is quadriplegic, one lost her leg. So the personal cost and tragedy is immense, and it has tested my ability to stay true to my desire to work towards healing and peace. It is a daily commitment, it is a daily effort, and a daily challenge. And unfortunately, there's so much information, misinformation, disinformation. There's exaggerations, there's truth, there's underreporting. But the reality is, and my family's from the north, is it's absolutely horrendous. There absolutely are large pockets of severe deprivation, severe hunger. Yes, some parts of Gaza have sprawling markets where you can still buy food and access food, and then there are parts that don't have any resemblance of like any access, I should say, to the most bare necessities to sustain life. And my brother and his family, and I helped get his wife and 4 children out of Gaza one day before the Rafah border was closed and taken out of commission after the Rafah operation began. And he was better connected than most in Gaza because he works for the humanitarian community. And Jake, when his children and I went and immediately met them, they were like their faces had shrunk, like bit, they were tiny bits of humans from what I knew them before October 7th. So there's been either this incessant like everybody in Gaza is starving or nobody is starving. The
Right.
fact of what is in between has been lost. There are pockets of absolute starvation. There are pockets of an abundance of access to aid and food and water. Where there's the abundance, people don't have money to pay for it. The aid that's been stolen, the aid that's been repackaged, or just like people are out of money. There's no money. No one's making any money. And then you have the bombardment, you have the killing, you have the people not being able to leave in safety. You have people living in tents. You have the lack of any basic medical care. My aunt, my mom's youngest sister, she has a chronic health condition and she's not been able to access her medication for 2 months now. And she will die. And I'm trying to get her out. And that's the story across the board, the daily suffering, the hardships, the hopelessness, most importantly, the sense of hopelessness, the sense that our lives have been destroyed, there's no horizon, we're going nowhere. That is, I would argue, the most dangerous of the horror, in that it can either turn people into indifferent, just zombies, if you will, because they can't survive, they can't, it's horrendous, or it can create the next wave of violent fighters and terrorists and people that want to kill Israelis and people that want to
Right.
implement revenge. So that's where I'm hoping that a
Right.
deal can be struck as soon as possible to get the hostages out, but to also recalibrate. Because a kinetic solution, kinetic being a fancy way of saying an explosive military solution, alone will never change the realities on the ground, will never get rid of Hamas.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that because we want to try and stay away from politics in this conversation, and so there's a political, we can talk about politics and the day after plan and whether there is one and there isn't one, who's going to do it, so all that stuff, fine. But what I would like to ask you about is more about this idea of de-radicalization of Gaza. I was speaking to a Muslim friend of mine who's Syrian Palestinian. He's an academic, actually in Israel last week. He wouldn't want me to mention his name because he doesn't want anyone to know he was in Israel. But we were talking, and he was confirming to me the reading of history where the Muslim world as a whole had this great sort of civilizational dominance in the past, ahead in the arts and the sciences and mathematics and medicine, was open to the world and collaborating with, sharing ideas, cross-fertilizing with other cultures. But since the Enlightenment and the rise of the West, it's become left behind in terms of technologically, economically, democratically, and in terms of wealth and power in the world by comparison to the West. And there's a sense, he was saying, that the existence of Israel is almost an insult to that. It aggravates that sense of lost honor. The fact that Jews, the weakest people, are able to have this place, a little bit of Arab land, and hold off everybody else, and to have such power. He was saying that feeds into a rejectionist mindset towards Israel. And of course, we know also that Hamas, we have radicalization in schools in Gaza. The West Bank is a separate story. I've spoken to people who come out of Gaza who's found lots of copies of Mein Kampf in buildings all over the place. We have some deep brainwashing going on over there. And I hear everything you've said about how people are ordinary people, and I know some of them, and I get that, and I'm not detracting from that for a moment. But I'm wondering, for the sake of peace in the future, aside from the politics, any political settlement, two-state solution or whatever, on a people-to-people level, what needs to happen, do you think, to make the culture in Gaza one that is compatible and friendly with Israel in the decades to come?
So I think going back to what I said earlier about people being a product of their environment, people being, I when 70 up to 70% of Gazans have never left the Gaza Strip, and unfortunately the only entry and exit way. That's why I felt so strongly about the airport work that I was doing. It was not just to facilitate the movement of students and patients. It was about creating a portal to the outside world, a gateway beyond just Egypt. Because to travel through Egypt, you have bribes, it costs a lot of money. Even before the war, it was not easy. You could not, as a simple average man or woman, just freely leave Gaza. It had to be through a series of networks and mechanisms, etc. So number one, people are a product of their environment, and if they're physically isolated, that's not a population that I can expect to behave as if they live in Geneva, Switzerland. So I want to open Gaza, and I want a portal into the outside world, so that, and yes, social media and technology shows Gazans what the rest of the world looks like, but it's different when you physically experience it. It's different when my brother's wife and children, when I took them out of Gaza, and then now they're in the UAE, they'd never been out of Gaza. They'd never been on an airplane. They'd never not known war. They'd never had electricity 24/7. So I cannot understate how that, due to Hamas's control, but also due to the set of restrictions, by Israel and Egypt, due to the Palestinian Authority neglecting to do more to help the people of Gaza, we have a population that had lived in isolation right next to a first world country. So that's number one. Number two is, yes, I absolutely think there needs to be courageous leadership that changes the totality of the Palestinian narrative, that challenges elements of it, that acknowledges our pain, acknowledges our suffering, and I think the justness of many of our claims to need self-determination and freedom and liberation, but also wakes us up from a lot of our delusions, that tells us there will not be a return of 5 million descendants of refugees to mainland Israel. There will not be an annihilation of Israel. And to be clear, many Palestinians in Gaza genuinely do not believe in the annihilation of Israel, even though they might profess or proclaim statements or philosophies or ideas that sound like they want to destroy Israel. They genuinely know that there's not going to be the destruction of Israel, no matter the delusions that Hamas sells them. But yes, we need leadership that also says the next battle, the next fight is that of development, of nation building, of education, of investing. This is what I tell people, and I'm delighted to see more and more Palestinians say this. What good is a Palestinian state or nation if the individual, if the actual, kind of building block of the state is somebody who is, you know, uneducated, not like academic education, but uneducated of how the world is evolving and shifting. The Arabs are moving on. Look at the Arabs. They want normalization with Israel. They want to focus on Iran. They want to deliver economic prosperity to their people. And so the Palestinian people and the narrative, I should say, the Palestinian narrative is frozen in time, as not only has Israel taken off, but the Arab world right now is a fundamentally different place. And that, yes, will translate to good leadership, a shifting of some of the education. I will say the actual curriculum itself, even though kindergartens, whatever, I think there's an overstating of the curriculum itself saying kill the Jews, kill the Israelis. I think what happens, and I remember this vividly because when I was there, the curriculum was paid for by Belgium and the international community. So it couldn't by law have like explicit calls to violence. What happens is a lot of teachers editorialize in schools. Teachers will kind of add it's like you have the lesson plan and then the teacher will say, oh yeah, and the Israel and the Zionists and this and that.
Right, but I think it has got worse since your time though, because I mean I've seen textbooks from there which measure the trajectory of teach physics in terms of the trajectory of rockets on Israel and that sort of stuff. So I think it's a mixed picture
Certainly.
now.
No, no,
You know,
again, I'm not
um,
understating. I'm simply saying that
yeah,
overstating the role of the curriculum without addressing the narrative,
right.
without addressing the totality of the circumstances. So it's like but the other thing too is, and I haven't cracked this, and I'd love to plant a seed here. We also got to do de-radicalization without maybe calling it de-radicalization. I studied counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. I have a degree in intelligence and national security. Like, when you tell people in Gaza, I want to de-radicalize you, there's a certain stigma that comes with it. And so like I want to develop a new Palestinian narrative, a third narrative, if you will. There's the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestine narrative, and I want to develop another one, but central to that is very much so the de-radicalization, but without actually calling it such. And I haven't cracked the code for how to frame it in the sense, but the actual action steps are there, and it is not just incumbent upon the Palestinians. The Arabs need to be involved, the regional and international community need to be involved, and most definitely Israel needs to be involved in terms of empowering the moderates by giving them wins. We cannot de-radicalize the people in Gaza while settler violence is out of control in the West Bank, or while the settlements are expanded in the West Bank. Those two are intricately linked. So it takes a holistic, integrative approach to make this de-radicalization successful.
Now, Ahmed, just a short pause. I want to ask you about your own work and the pushback you face in the Muslim community and all that. But I have to, because we're started a bit late, I've got to be on TV in 5 minutes for only a very short hit. So either we can wrap it now and we'll do that another day, or we can come back in like 20 minutes, half an hour, and finish the conversation. It's really up to you and your time.
Yeah, I think we can certainly wrap it up now, and maybe I'm more than happy to come back on and do like episode two if you think that would be helpful. But I've got quite a bit happening unfortunately today that I must attend to.
Okay, well, so we wrap it now, and we can check in again in a while, and we can do another podcast, and we can talk
Ab-
about that in particular
Absolutely,
maybe.
absolutely.
Okay, great. All right, well, let me just conclude it now. I'll wrap it up, and then we'll let you go. So. Well, Ahmed, thank you so much for that really insightful and moving conversation. If we were in the same country, I'd come over and give you a hug right now, but I can't.
I
So
would love that
thank
as
you
well. And
anyway. And
I
um,
cannot understate the need to keep those conversations going. But also, I appreciate how you framed it. You didn't start out by, picking out all the things that you're going to disagree with me and like confront me on, and like you actually wanted to humanize me. You wanted to learn about Ahmed. You wanted to learn about the story. And I think I hold multiple truths. You know that we do have things that we likely don't agree on, but I immensely appreciate how you wanted to focus on the humanity. You wanted to focus on the areas that we agree, and giving me the space to share this with your audience. I very much so appreciate that.
right. Well, I mean, I do feel we talked about this a little bit off air, but I do feel that as long as your heart's in the right place, you can disagree fine. It's just when your disagreement is a proxy for some hatred or some bigotry or prejudice that it goes bad. So anyway, so disagreement is totally fine, and we can do it. And maybe next time we'll get to
Absolutely.
that.
Would love to come back
But
on
thank you so much for joining me,
and
and
do this again.
I look forward to having you write for us again and do another podcast with you in the coming
Absolutely.
months.
Would
So
love to.
thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much, Jake.
Bye bye. Great. Okay, so if you mind